The arid wind swept across the dusty streets of San Miguel Seco, carrying with it the scent of parched earth and desperation. Lucia stood frozen at the doorway of their modest adobe home, her knuckles white against the wooden frame. Inside, her stepfather José's voice thundered like an approaching storm. From where she stood, she could clearly see her mother's face, once radiant with warmth, now a mask of resigned submission. The conversation inside the house turned to whispers, but Lucia had heard enough. Her name, a sum of money, a man from the capital, a debt to be paid. When José noticed her shadow by the door, his eyes narrowed dangerously. A silent warning passed between them. Without a word, Lucia backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She retreated to the small courtyard behind, the house where laundry hung listlessly in the still afternoon air. What remained of her world was crumbling beneath her feet. Lucia closed her eyes, allowing herself to slip back into memories of what once was, before José, before everything changed. She had been just 16 when her father was still alive. The memory came to her with the clarity of water from the mountain springs that never reached their parched town. Her father, Emilio, with his gentle hands calloused from decades of working the unforgiving land, teaching her how to coax life from the resistant soil. It was in those golden days that the small garden behind their house had flourished against, all odds defiantly green against the beige landscape that dominated San Miguel Seco. Emilio would smile at her, eyes crinkling at the corners, and say, "Child, remember this. Even in the driest places, life finds a way. Just like these flowers, you must always find a way." The crack of a door yanked Lucia back to the present. José stood in the yard now, his shadow stretching toward her like an omen. 20 pesos short again this week, he said, his voice deceptively calm. The fields are not producing, and your mother's sewing barely covers our food. Lucia kept her eyes lowered, knowing that meeting his gaze would only ignite his temper. José had appeared in their lives like an unexpected thunderstorm just months after her father's passing, when grief still hung heavy in their home. He had seemed a salvation. At first, a provider, a protector. Her mother, drowning in debt and despair, had welcomed him with desperate hope. That hope had withered faster than unwatered crops under the merciless Oaxacan sun. "What do you expect me to do?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. José's laugh held no humor. "Diego will be here tomorrow. He works for Don Alejandro in the capital. The debt must be settled one way or another." The implication of his words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating, like the humidity before a storm that never comes. "You will make yourself presentable," he continued, 21 years old and still unmarried. People talk. This arrangement could benefit everyone. Arrangement. The word slithered around Lucia like a serpent. She wanted to scream, to fight, to run, but where would she go? Who would take in a penniless young woman with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of impossible dreams? When José left, the courtyard felt both emptier and less suffocating. Lucia sank to her knees beside the nearly dry water basin. The face that stared back at her from the rippling surface was a stranger's, hollowed cheeks, eyes too large and haunted, hair pulled back severely from a face that had forgotten how to smile. For 5 years she had endured. For 5 years she had watched her mother transform from the vibrant, loving woman of her childhood into a shadow that moved silently through their home, speaking only when necessary, living only because dying would be an indulgence she could not afford. Inside the house, her mother called her name. Lucia closed her eyes, gathering what little strength remained in her weary soul. Tomorrow, this Diego would arrive. Tomorrow, her worth would be measured and exchanged like cattle at the Sunday market. Tonight, she still belonged to herself. The evening melted into night, stars puncturing the vast darkness above San Miguel Seco like tiny holes in a black blanket. Lucia sat atop the flat roof of their home, her legs drawn to her chest, eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the mountains stood like ancient guardians. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay the capital, teeming with life and possibilities she could barely imagine. Somewhere out there, people were dancing, laughing, falling in love by choice rather than transaction. Somewhere, women walked with their heads high, unafraid of the men in their lives. A soft sound behind her announced. Her mother's presence before gentle hands placed a worn shawl around her shoulders. "You'll catch cold," Elena murmured, settling beside her daughter with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of decades rather than years. For a long moment they sat in silence, two women adrift in a sea of circumstances beyond their control. When Elena finally spoke, her voice held a tremor that Lucia hadn't heard since the day they lowered her father into the unyielding earth. "I never wanted this life for you, mi hija. When you were born, I dreamed of so much more." Lucia turned to look at her mother, truly look at her, for the first time in months. The moonlight was kind to Elena, softening the lines that worry and hardship had etched into her once beautiful face. For a moment, Lucia could see the woman her father had loved with such devotion, the woman who had sung lullabies and told stories of brave princesses who saved themselves. "What happened to us, Mama?" Lucia whispered. Elena's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Life, mi amor. Life happened to us. One small choice after another, until the path back to what we wanted disappeared completely." Her mother's hand found hers, warm despite the night chill. "This Diego I asked Maria about. Him, she says he's not like Jose. She says he's a good man." "A good master is still a master, Mama." Elena sighed. "Sometimes, Lucia, freedom comes in unexpected packages. Sometimes we must accept what is offered before we can find what we seek." Before Lucia could respond, the sound of breaking glass echoed from below, followed by Jose's drunken curse. Elena's body tensed, her momentary softness vanishing like morning mist under the harsh sun. "You should sleep," she said, rising quickly. "Tomorrow will come whether we are ready or not." Left alone once more, Lucia turned her gaze back to the distant mountains, to the stars that had witnessed the birth and death of countless dreams across the centuries. If her father was right, if life truly found a way even in the driest places, then perhaps somewhere within her a seed of hope might still germinate. Or perhaps some soil was simply too barren for anything to grow. The memory came unbidden, sharp and clear as broken glass. Lucia, 13 years old, sitting beside her father as he fought for each ragged breath. The consumption had taken him, slowly, then all at once, a creeping shadow that had darkened their home for months before finally extinguishing the light in Emilio's eyes. "You must be strong for your mother," he had whispered, his once strong hand frail against her cheek. "Promise me, Lucia. Promise me you'll find happiness, no matter what comes." She had promised, tears streaming down her face, not understanding then how difficult such a vow would be to keep. Now, 8 years later, Lucia stood in the small room she shared with her mother, wearing the only dress she owned that wasn't patched or faded, a simple blue cotton garment that had once belonged to her cousin in the neighboring village. Her mother moved around her like a hummingbird, adjusting the fabric, pinning her hair, applying a touch of rouge salvaged from the bottom of an ancient tin. "Enough, Mama," Lucia finally said, gently catching her mother's restless hands. "I'm not a bride preparing for her wedding." Elena's eyes clouded. "You're all I have, mi hija, all that matters in this world." Before Lucia could respond, a commotion outside drew their attention, the distinctive sound of a truck laboring up the dusty road that led to their house, a rarity in San Miguel Seco, where most traveled by foot or burro. "He's here," Elena whispered unnecessarily. The sound of José's voice carried through the thin walls, uncharacteristically jovial. Lucia felt her stomach twist into knots. This was really happening. She was being handed over to a stranger to settle her stepfather's gambling debts. "You don't have to do this," Elena said, suddenly, her voice low and urgent. "We could leave tonight. Go to your tia in Puebla." For a moment, hope fluttered in Lucia's chest like a wounded bird attempting flight. Then reality settled once more. "And then what, Mama? José would find us. You know he would." A sharp rap at the door ended theirs whispered exchange. "Showtime!" José called, his voice slick with false cheer. Taking a deep breath, Lucia squeezed her mother's hands, then walked toward the door with her chin lifted, a final defiant gesture against the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. The main room of their modest home had been cleared and cleaned for the occasion. José stood near the wooden table, a smile plastered on his face that didn't reach his eyes. Beside him stood a man Lucia had never seen before. He wasn't what she had expected. Diego appeared to be in his early 30s, with a lean build and skin darkened by outdoor work. His clothes were simple but clean, a white cotton shirt, worn, jeans, boots that had seen better days. But it was his eyes that caught Lucia's attention, dark brown and watchful, revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Diego," José said expansively, "this is my stepdaughter, Lucia. As you can see, she's a beauty, just as I said." Diego's gaze rested on Lucia, assessing but not in the way she had feared, not like the predatory looks she received from men in the marketplace. Instead, he seemed to be looking beyond her appearance, as if searching for something else entirely. "Señorita," he said with a slight nod, his voice deeper than she had anticipated. "Señor," she responded, hating the slight tremor in her voice. José clapped his hands together. "Well, let's discuss the arrangements, shall we? Elena has prepared some coffee." As her mother silently poured the precious coffee they had been saving for weeks, Lucia remained standing, unsure of her place in this bizarre negotiation. Diego seemed equally uncomfortable, his large hands wrapped around the small cup, eyes darting occasionally to Lucia before returning to José. "Don Alejandro was very clear about the terms," Diego finally said. "If I take responsibility for your debt, it is settled in full." José waved a dismissive hand. Of course. And you get a beautiful hard-working wife in the bargain, Lucia. Knows how to cook, clean, sew, all the wifely duties." Lucia felt heat rising to her cheeks at being discussed like livestock at auction. When she dared to look at Diego, she was surprised to find his expression had hardened. "I didn't agree to purchase a wife, señor. I agreed to help settle a debt on behalf of my employer." José's smile faltered. "Call it what you will. The arrangement stands." Diego set down his cup with deliberate care. "May I speak with Lucia? Alone?" The request hung in the air like smoke. Jose's eyes narrowed dangerously. What for? Everything can be discussed here. It is she who would be coming with me, no?
I believe she deserves a voice in this matter. Lucia stared at Diego in surprise. No one had suggested she might have a choice in the matter, not Jose, not even her mother in her cautious way. Jose looked ready to object, but Elena spoke.
First, they can talk in the courtyard. It's proper. We can see them from the window. After a moment of tense silence, Jose jerked his head toward the door. Make it quick. We have matters to settle before nightfall. The courtyard was bathed in the harsh light of midday, the few scraggly plants wilting in the heat. Lucia stood with her back to the adobe wall, watching Diego warily as he kept a respectful distance between them. I'm sorry for this situation. Señorita, he said, without preamble, this was not what I expected when Don Alejandro sent me to collect his money. Lucia lifted her chin. And what did you expect, Señor? Diego ran a hand through his short black hair. Justice, perhaps, or at least business conducted with honor. There is little honor to be found in San Miguel Seco these days, Lucia said bitterly. A ghost of a smile touched Diego's lips. So I see. He fell silent, studying her with those unreadable eyes. The distant sound of children playing in the village square floated on the hot, still air. I will not force you to come with me, he finally said. But I fear what will happen if you stay. The simple statement, delivered without drama or
Flourish struck Lucia like a physical blow. It was the first time anyone had acknowledged the danger lurking beneath her daily existence.
My mother, she began, then faltered. Diego nodded. She could come too. My employer's hacienda is large. There is always work for those willing to do it. Lucia searched his face for deception, for the hidden motives that experience had taught her to expect from men offering salvation. She found only a steady gaze and what appeared to be genuine concern. Why would you help us? She asked. You don't know us. Diego looked away, his profile sharp against the whitewashed wall. Perhaps I know more than you think, Señorita. Perhaps I recognize something in your situation that feels familiar. Before she could question him further, Jose's voice called from the doorway. The coffee is getting cold, and my patience with it. Diego straightened. Whatever you decide,
I will respect, but decide quickly. I leave this afternoon with or without you.
As they returned to the stifling atmosphere of the main room, Lucia felt something shift within her. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its distant cousin. A possibility where before there had been none. Jose wasted no time. So, is everything settled? Diego looked to Lucia, clearly waiting for her to speak. In that moment, she felt the weight of her father's last request. Promise me you'll find happiness no matter what comes. I will go, she said quietly. But my mother comes with me. Jose's face darkened. Absolutely not. Elena stays here, where she belongs. Then the deal is off, Diego said firmly. Both women or none. And Don Alejandro will be most displeased to learn his debt remains unpaid. The threat hung in the air. Everyone in the region knew of Don Alejandro's power and influence, and of his reputation for dealing harshly with those who crossed him. Jose's jaw worked as he calculated his options. Fine, he spat finally. Take them both. Less mouths to feed here anyway. Relief washed over Lucia like cool water. Whatever awaited her at Don Alejandro's hacienda, it had to be better than the slow death she was experiencing under Jose's roof. We leave in 1 hour, Diego said. "Pack only what you can carry." As Lucia and Elena hurried to gather their meager belongings, Jose cornered Diego by the door. Lucia couldn't hear what was said, but the threatening posture of her stepfather and the rigid set of Diego's shoulders told her enough. Whatever this new chapter held, the old one was closing with the same ugliness that had characterized it from the beginning. 1 hour later, as the sun began its descent, Lucia and Elena climbed into the back of Diego's dusty truck. Jose watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. No goodbyes were exchanged, no tears shed. Only when the truck started moving, when the house began to recede in the distance, did Lucia allow herself to exhale the breath she'd been holding for what felt like years. As San Miguel Seco disappeared behind them, Elena reached for her daughter's hand. "Whatever comes, mihija, we face it together." Lucia nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, her mind already racing toward an unknown future. The arid landscape rushed past them, unchanging, unyielding, yet somehow less oppressive than it had seemed just hours before. In the driver's seat, Diego remained silent, his profile silhouetted against the reddening sky. An enigma, this man who had appeared like an unlikely savior in their darkest hour. Lucia studied him surreptitiously, wondering what secrets he carried, what motives drove him beyond the simple settlement of a debt. As if sensing her gaze, Diego glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to the road. The truck accelerated, carrying them toward the distant mountains that had long represented an impossible boundary in Lucia's mind. For the first time in years, the tightness in her chest began to loosen. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to wonder, what if? The truck groaned as it crested yet another hill, the engine protesting against the steep terrain. They had been traveling for hours, leaving behind the familiar landscape of San Miguel Seco for regions Lucia had only heard about in stories. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped sharply, and Elena dozed fitfully beside her, wrapped in the thin blanket Diego had produced from behind his seat. Lucia remained wide awake, her mind racing faster than the vehicle that carried them toward their uncertain destination. Occasionally, her eyes would meet Diego's in the rearview mirror, brief, wordless exchanges that left her more confused than enlightened about their unlikely savior. "You should rest," he said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between
them for miles. "We won't reach the hacienda until morning." "I'm not tired," she replied, which wasn't entirely true.
Her body ached from the jolting ride over poorly maintained roads, but her mind refused to surrender to sleep. Diego nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. "The mountains are beautiful at night," he observed, like silent giants, watching over us. The poetic observation surprised her. "Is that how you see them?" A small smile touched his lips. "My father was a storyteller. He taught me to see the world through different eyes. And what does Don Alejandro pay you to see through?"
"His eyes?"
The question emerged sharper than she'd intended, edged with the bitterness she'd cultivated as protection against disappointment. Diego's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Don Alejandro pays me to manage his northern properties and collect his debts. What I see is my own business." Silence fell between them once more, heavy with unasked questions and unspoken fears. The truck's headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, illuminating nothing beyond the immediate road ahead. When they stopped briefly for Diego to check the engine, which had begun making an ominous clicking sound, Lucia stepped out to stretch her legs. The night air was crisp and clean, so different from the stagnant heat of San Miguel Seco. Above them, stars scattered across the vast sky like spilled salt on black cloth. Diego appeared beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "It's the timing belt," he explained, though she hadn't asked. "It will hold until we reach Don Guillermo's place." "Don Guillermo?" "A friend. We'll rest there tonight and continue in the morning." Lucia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were, two women alone with a man they barely knew, miles from anything familiar. As if reading her thoughts, Diego added gently, "He has a wife and daughters. You and your mother will be comfortable there." The consideration in this simple statement caught Lucia off guard. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue after years of receiving so little kindness. Diego merely nodded, his attention returning to the truck. There was something about him that didn't fit the narrative José had constructed. This was not a man who would purchase a woman to settle a debt. Yet, here they were. Don Guillermo's rancho appeared like a mirage in the pre-dawn light, a sprawling adobe structure with a red-tiled roof surrounded by land that appeared significantly more fertile than that of San Miguel Seco. Dogs announced their arrival with enthusiastic barking, bringing a stout man to the door before Diego had even cut the engine. "What brings you at this ungodly hour, amigo?" the man called out, before noticing the two women in the truck. His eyebrows rose, but to his credit, he asked no immediate questions. "Mechanical troubles and a long story," Diego responded, embracing the older man with genuine warmth. "Is Maria awake? For you?" "Always. Come, all of you." The interior of the house was warm and inviting, scented with wood smoke and cooking spices. A woman appeared from what Lucia assumed was the kitchen,
her round face lighting up at the sight of Diego. "Our wayward son returns,"
she exclaimed, enveloping him in a hug that spoke of long familiarity. The woman then turned her kind gaze to Lucia and Elena. "And who are these travelers?" Before Diego could answer, Don Guillermo raised a hand. "First, food and rest. Stories can wait for daylight." After a simple but hearty meal of beans, tortillas, and eggs that Maria insisted they eat despite the early hour, Lucia and Elena were shown to a small but clean room with two narrow beds. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were offered hospitality with no strings attached, no debts to be paid. As sunlight began to filter through the small window, Elena sat heavily on one of the beds, her face showing the fatigue she had been hiding for hours.
"Are we doing the right thing, Mama?" Lucia asked softly, the doubt she had been suppressing finally breaking free. Elena reached for her daughter's hand. "When your father was dying, he made me promise to keep you safe and help you find happiness."
"I have failed at both for too long." Tears pricked at Lucia's eyes. "You did your best." "No, mi hija. I surrendered to fear and allowed José to destroy what remained of our family. Perhaps this is our second chance." Sleep came for both of them then, deep and dreamless. The sleep of those who have been carrying too heavy a burden for too long. They awoke to afternoon light and the sound of female voices outside their door. Two young women, perhaps a few, years older than Lucia, entered with fresh towels and clean clothes. "Mama sent these," the taller one said, with a friendly smile. "I'm Carmela, and this is my sister Sophia. Papa says you'll be staying with us today while Diego fixes the truck." The casual mention of Diego's name, the easy familiarity with which they referred to him, eased something in Lucia's chest. These people knew him well, trusted him. After washing away the dust of travel and changing into the borrowed dresses, Lucia and Elena joined the family in the main room. Diego was nowhere to be seen, but Don Guillermo sat at the head of the table, smoking a pipe and reading what appeared to be a letter. "Ah, our guests emerge," he said warmly. "I hope you rested well?" "Very well, thank you," Elena answered, her voice stronger than Lucia had heard it in years. "Your hospitality is most generous." Don Guillermo waved away the gratitude. "Any friend of Diego's is welcome here, though I admit he doesn't usually arrive with such beautiful companions." There was no lasciviousness in the compliment, only genuine warmth that made Lucia blush, despite herself. "Where is Señor Diego?" she asked. "Collecting parts for the truck. In the village. He'll return by sunset. In the meantime, perhaps you'd care to take some air in the garden. Sitting in that truck for so long can't have been comfortable." The garden behind the house was a revelation, lush with vegetation that had no business thriving in such a climate. Fruit trees, flowering bushes, and carefully tended vegetable plots created a paradise that reminded Lucia painfully of her father's modest garden from her childhood. "Impressive, isn't it?" Carmela said, appearing beside her. "Diego designed it for us 3 years ago. Before that, nothing would grow but the most stubborn weeds." "Diego did this?" Lucia couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "I thought he worked for Don Alejandro." Carmela laughed, the sound as bright as the flowers surrounding them. "Diego does many things. He has a gift for making things grow where others see only barren ground." The metaphor wasn't lost on Lucia, who felt something unfamiliar stirring within her, a sensation so long absent she barely recognized it. Hope. As promised, Diego returned as the sun began its descent, his truck loaded with parts and supplies. He joined them for the evening meal, during which Don Guillermo regaled them with stories of his youth that had everyone laughing, even Elena, whose laughter Lucia had nearly forgotten the sound of. Later, as twilight deepened into night, Lucia found herself alone with Diego on the veranda, the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine heavy in the air. "They're good people," she said, nodding toward the house where sounds of the family preparing for bed could be heard. "The best I know," Diego agreed. "They took me in when I had nothing, taught me to work the land." "Is that how you came to work for Don Alejandro? Through farming?" Diego's expression clouded slightly. "In a manner of speaking. Don Alejandro saw potential in me that others missed. He offered opportunities I couldn't refuse." Something in his tone made Lucia wonder what price those opportunities had carried. Before she could ask, Diego turned the conversation. "Your mother seems stronger today." "She is. I'd forgotten what she was like before everything changed." Diego nodded, understanding without requiring elaboration. "And you? Are you having second thoughts about leaving San Miguel Seco?" The question caught her off guard with its directness. "No," she answered truthfully, "but I'm uncertain about what awaits us. Don Alejandro's hacienda is vast. There are many families who live and work there. You and your mother will have your own quarters, your own privacy. And what will be expected of us? Of me?" The real question hung unspoken between them. Diego met her gaze steadily. "Only what you're willing to give, Lucia. Despite what Jose may have implied, I did not bring you here as payment for his debt." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by suspicion, born of harsh experience. "Then why did you bring us?" For a long moment Diego was silent, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains now visible only as darker shadows against the night sky. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but clear. 5 years ago, my sister was in a situation similar to yours. Her husband was a cruel man who saw her as property rather than a partner. I was working far away and didn't know. By the time I returned, he paused, his jaw tightening. By the time I returned, she was gone. I couldn't save her. The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed, despite the passage of years. Lucia felt her throat constrict with empathy. "I'm sorry," was all she could manage. Diego nodded once, acknowledging her sympathy. When Don Alejandro sent me to collect José's debt, I had no idea what I would find. But the moment I saw your eyes, I recognized the same look my sister had. I couldn't walk away. Not again. The simple honesty of his explanation struck Lucia more powerfully than any elaborate justification could have. For the first time since leaving San Miguel Seco, she felt truly certain they had made the right choice. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Diego's expression lightened slightly. "Now we finish repairing the truck. Tomorrow we continue to Don Alejandro's hacienda. And then," he shrugged, "and then you and your mother begin your new lives, however you choose to shape them. As simple as that?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Nothing worth having is ever simple, Lucia. But some complications are worth embracing." Their conversation was interrupted by Maria, who came to inform them that hot water for bathing had been prepared. As Lucia rose to go inside, Diego gently caught her wrist, a touch so light she could have easily pulled away. "Whatever happens at the hacienda," he said, "never forget that you chose this path. Your destiny is your own now." The words followed Lucia into sleep that night, weaving through her dreams like golden threads through dark fabric. For the first time in 5 years, she dreamed not of escape, but of possibility. The hacienda appeared.
On the horizon, like something from another world, a sprawling estate of whitewashed buildings with terracotta roofs,
Surrounded by fields so green they seemed artificial after the barren landscape of San Miguel Seco. As Diego guided the truck through wrought iron gates that stood open in apparent welcome, Lucia felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. Elena reached for her hand, squeezing gently. Together she whispered, the word carrying the weight of a promise. "Don Alejandro is away on business in Mexico City," Diego explained, as they followed a winding drive toward the main house. "He won't return for at least 2 weeks." Lucia wasn't sure if this news brought relief or additional anxiety. The mysterious Don Alejandro had loomed large in her imagination during their journey, a powerful man to whom even José owed deference. The truck stopped before a 2-story building that, while not as grand as the main house visible in the distance, was still more substantial than any dwelling Lucia had ever called home. A middle-aged woman emerged from the doorway, her stern expression softening slightly at the sight of Diego. "You're late," she stated without preamble. "We expected you yesterday." "Mechanical troubles, Carmelita," Diego replied easily, apparently unperturbed by her brusque manner. "This is Elena and her daughter Lucia. They'll be staying with us." The woman's gaze swept over them, assessing rather than judgmental. Don Alejandro mentioned nothing about guests. "They're not guests. They're joining the household staff. Elena is an excellent seamstress, and Lucia—" Diego hesitated. "I can cook, clean, garden, whatever is needed," Lucia interjected, unwilling to appear helpless or useless. Carmelita's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "We'll see. Come inside." "You must be exhausted." The interior of the building was cool and dim after the bright sunlight, simply but comfortably
furnished.
Carmelita, who introduced herself as the housekeeper, led them upstairs to a small suite of rooms, a sitting area with 2 modest bedrooms opening off it. These were my son's quarters before he moved to Guadalajara, she explained. They've been vacant for over a year. You'll be comfortable here. Lucia turned in a slow circle, taking in details that spoke of luxury by her standards: clean curtains at the windows, a small bookshelf with actual books, rugs on the wooden floors. It's very generous, she said, her voice hushed with disbelief. Carmelita shrugged. Diego vouches for you. That's enough for now. Rest today. Tomorrow we'll discuss your duties. When the housekeeper had departed, leaving them to settle in, Elena sank onto a chair, tears streaming suddenly down her face. Mama, what's wrong? Lucia knelt beside her, alarmed. Elena shook her head, smiling through her tears. Nothing is wrong, mihija. For the first time in years, nothing is wrong. Understanding dawned on Lucia as she looked around the simple but clean rooms, rooms without Jose's lingering presence, rooms where they might begin to breathe freely again. She rested her head in her mother's lap, allowing her own tears to fall at last. That evening, Diego came to escort them to dinner in the staff dining room. The room buzzed with conversation that abruptly ceased when they entered, curious eyes examining the newcomers with undisguised interest. My friends, Diego announced. This is Elena and Lucia. They have joined us from San Miguel Seco and will be part of the household staff. Please make them welcome. What followed was a blur of introductions. The cook, Doña Matilde, whose plump hands were constantly in motion. Hernando, the stable master, with a weathered face and surprisingly gentle smile. Young Pablo, who couldn't be more than 15 but was apparently responsible for the vegetable gardens, and at least a dozen others whose names Lucia couldn't hope to remember immediately. Dinner was simple but abundant: bean soup, fresh bread, roasted chicken, and vegetables that tasted of sunshine and rich soil. Lucia ate carefully, conscious of eyes still watching them, questions hanging unasked in the air. When the meal concluded, an older man named Sebastian, who had been introduced as the estate manager, approached their table. Diego tells me you have experience with gardening, señorita, he said to Lucia. Our greenhouse needs attention. Perhaps you would be interested. Before she could respond, Carmelita interjected. I thought she would assist me with the household duties. She can do both, Diego suggested. The greenhouse in the mornings, the house in the afternoons. Sebastian and Carmelita exchanged glances that Lucia couldn't interpret. Very well, Sebastian said finally. Report to the greenhouse after breakfast tomorrow. Pablo will show you what needs to be done. As they were returning to their quarters, Lucia found herself walking beside Diego, slightly apart from the others. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? For giving me choices, for not simply telling me what I must do. Diego's expression was unreadable in the gathering darkness. Everyone deserves choices, Lucia, even when they seem small. She studied his profile, wondering again about the man behind the formal exterior. In the 3 days since he had appeared in their lives, he had shown more compassion and consideration than Jose had in 5 years. You work for Don Alejandro, but this feels like your home, she observed. The staff respects you. Diego smiled faintly. I've been here 7 years. These people are my family now in many ways. And Don Alejandro? What kind of man is he? Something flickered across Diego's face, an emotion Lucia couldn't identify. Complex, he answered finally, demanding but fair in his way. You'll form your own opinion when you meet him. They had reached the door to Lucia and Elena's quarters. Before she could say goodnight, Diego spoke again, his voice low. Be careful, Lucia. The hacienda has its own politics, its own hierarchies. Not everyone will welcome newcomers with open arms. The warning surprised her. Is there someone specific?
I should be wary of. Diego hesitated. Observe before you trust. That's all I can say for now.
With that cryptic advice, he bid her good night, leaving Lucia to wonder what currents ran beneath the seemingly peaceful surface of life at the hacienda. The greenhouse proved to be Lucia's salvation in the days that followed. A crystal palace. Of glass and iron, it housed exotic plants from regions far beyond Oaxaca, delicate orchids, tropical fruits, and flowering vines that transformed the space into a fragrant paradise. Under Pablo's enthusiastic guidance, she learned the specific needs of each plant, which required more water, which thrived in direct sunlight, which needed the careful application of nutrients mixed according to Sebastian's precise formulas. In the quiet moments between tasks, surrounded by green life and warm, humid air, Lucia found herself returning to the person she had been before Jose entered their lives. Curious, hopeful, alive to possibility. Afternoons brought different challenges as she assisted Carmelita with the endless tasks required to maintain a household of such size. The housekeeper proved to be stern but fair, quick to correct but equally quick to acknowledge good work. By the end of the first week, Lucia had earned a nod of approval that, according to the other maids, was rarer than rainfall in San Miguel Seco. Elena, meanwhile, had found her place in the sewing room, where her skill with needle and thread quickly established her as an asset. The clothes and linens of the hacienda required constant attention, and Elena's fingers were faster and more precise than those of the two elderly women who had previously handled all the mending. On the 8th day, as Lucia carefully transplanted seedlings in the greenhouse, a shadow fell across her work table. Looking up, she found herself face to face with a young woman she had never seen before, strikingly beautiful, with honey-colored hair and eyes the green gold of new leaves. "So you're the famous Lucia," the woman said, her accent marking her as educated, perhaps even foreign. "I've heard so much about you." Lucia wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of the dirt. Beneath her fingernails, the perspiration dampening her simple dress. "I'm afraid you have the advantage, señorita." "I don't know who you are." The woman laughed, the sound like crystal wind chimes. "Isabella Reyes Montero. Don Alejandro's niece, and it seems your competition." "Competition?" Lucia echoed, confusion evident in her voice. Isabella leaned closer, her expensive perfume mingling oddly with the earthy scents of the greenhouse. For Diego's attention, of course. "The entire household is buzzing about how he brought you here, how he speaks to you, how he looks at you." Heat rushed to Lucia's cheeks. "You're mistaken. Senor Diego brought my mother and me here out of kindness, nothing more." "Kindness?" Isabella's perfect eyebrows arched in apparent amusement. "Diego Herrera is many things, but kind is not among them. He is ambitious, calculating, and utterly devoted to my uncle's interests. Whatever reason he had for bringing you here, I assure you it wasn't kindness." Before Lucia could respond to this startling assessment, Pablo appeared from between the rows of plants, his young face lighting up at the sight of Isabella. "Señorita Isabella," he exclaimed, "when did you return from Mexico City?" "This morning." "Little one," Isabella replied, her tone warming considerably. "And I've brought you a present. Come find me later." As Pablo beamed with pleasure, Isabella turned back to Lucia, her smile cooling several degrees. "Welcome to Hacienda Reyes, Lucia. I do hope you'll find your stay educational." With that parting remark, she glided away, leaving behind a lingering cloud of expensive perfume and unease. "What's wrong?" Pablo asked, noticing Lucia's troubled expression. "Nothing," she assured him quickly. "Tell me about these seedlings. Are they ready for the south bed?" The conversation with Isabella nagged at Lucia throughout the day, disrupting the tentative peace she had been building. When she encountered Diego that evening, as she was finishing her work in the main house, she found herself studying him with new eyes, searching for signs of the calculating ambition Isabella had described. Diego seemed to notice her scrutiny. "Is something troubling you?" he asked, as they walked toward the staff quarters. "I met Señorita Isabella today," Lucia replied, watching his face carefully. Something tightened in his expression, so briefly she might have imagined it had she not been looking for exactly such a reaction. "Ah, I wasn't aware she had returned from Mexico City. She had some interesting things to say about you." Diego stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "I imagine she did. Isabella has a gift for crafting narratives that serve her purposes. So she was lying. Not lying, perhaps. Seeing through her particular lens, we have a complicated history." The admission hung between them in the warm evening air. Lucia found herself unreasonably bothered by the implication of a personal connection between Diego and the beautiful, sophisticated
niece of Don Alejandro.
"She seems to think you brought me here for reasons beyond simple kindness," Lucia said, trying and failing to keep her tone neutral. Diego's eyes searched hers, as if trying to read the thoughts behind them. Did she suggest what those reasons might be? She implied. Lucia hesitated, suddenly embarrassed. She implied there was a personal interest. To her surprise, Diego didn't immediately deny it. Instead, he said softly, "Would that be so impossible to believe?" The question caught her entirely off guard. Lucia stared at him, heat rising to her cheeks, words failing her completely. Before she could recover her composure, a voice called Diego's name from the direction of the main house. Turning, they saw Sebastian beckoning urgently. "We'll continue this conversation later," Diego said, his eyes still holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. "Rest well, Lucia." As he walked away, Lucia remained rooted to the spot, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. What had just happened? What had he meant? Later that night, as she lay in bed, listening to her mother's gentle breathing from the adjacent room, Lucia replayed the exchange in her mind. Would that be so impossible to believe? The question seemed to hang in the darkness above her, unanswerable, yet demanding a response. Sleep eluded her until the early hours
of the morning.
When she finally succumbed, her dreams were a confused tangle of Diego's steady gaze, Isabella's knowing smile, and the ghost of her father warning her about something she couldn't quite hear. Dawn broke with unusual violence the next morning. Lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling across the mountains like the voice of an angry god. Lucia stood at the window of their sitting room, watching sheets of rain transform the carefully maintained grounds into a series of muddy rivers. A storm was coming, Carmelita had been saying for days. Now it has arrived. The words seemed prophetic, beyond their meteorological meaning. Lucia couldn't shake the feeling that something else was brewing, something that would affect them all in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. Elena appeared beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder.
"No greenhouse work today, I imagine." Lucia shook her head.
Sebastian said to report to the main house instead. They're moving furniture to protect against leaks. The day passed in a blur of activity as the entire household mobilized to defend against the storm's assault. Lucia found herself working alongside people she normally saw only in passing, stable hands, field workers, even the aloof kitchen staff. The shared urgency created a temporary equality, that transcended the usual hierarchies. By mid-afternoon, when the worst of the downpour had passed, leaving behind a steady, soaking rain, Lucia was assigned to help in the kitchen. Doña Matilde handed her a knife and pointed to a mountain of vegetables destined for the evening stew. "You have good hands," the cook observed after watching Lucia work for several minutes. "Quick and careful, not like some of these clumsy girls." Lucia smiled, pleased by the rare compliment. "My father taught me," he said, "a sharp knife and patience could transform anything." Doña Matilde nodded approvingly. "A wise man, your father." As they worked side by side, the cook gradually warmed to conversation, sharing bits of gossip about the household that provided Lucia with a deeper understanding of the complex social web she had entered. "Don Alejandro returns tomorrow," Doña Matilde mentioned casually. "Earlier than expected because of the storm. They say he's bringing guests from the capital." "Important guests?" Lucia asked, trying to sound merely conversational rather than intensely. "Curious." The cook snorted. "Politicians, most likely. Don Alejandro plays his games and we feed his pawns." Something in her tone caught Lucia's attention. "You don't approve of your employer?" Doña Matilde cast a quick glance around the kitchen, ensuring they weren't overheard. "I've served the Reyes family for 30 years. I watched Don Alejandro grow from a boy into a man. I know what he is capable of, both good and bad." The cryptic statement hung between them, begging for elaboration. Before Lucia could probe further, however, the door to the kitchen burst open, admitting a very wet Diego. "Doña Matilde," he said urgently, ignoring social niceties. "Don Alejandro's party has been spotted on the North Road. They'll be here within the hour. We need food, hot drinks, anything to warm them." The cook immediately shifted into high efficiency, barking orders to her staff. Lucia found herself swept up in the preparations assigned to help prepare rooms in the main house for the unexpected guests. As she hurried across the muddy courtyard, a hand caught her arm, pulling her beneath the shelter of a portico. Diego stood there, rain dripping from his hair, his expression tense. "Listen carefully," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Don Alejandro doesn't know about you and your mother yet. I plan to speak with him privately before introducing you." Lucia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. I assumed he had approved our coming here." Diego shook his head. "I made that decision on my own authority. Usually he would accept my judgment in such matters, but what?" Lucia demanded, alarm growing in her chest. "He's bringing Manuel Vargas with him, a potential business partner from Mexico City. Isabella has been encouraging the connection. The significance of this information escaped Lucia entirely. What does that have to do with my mother and me?" Diego's eyes met hers, dark with an emotion she couldn't name. Vargas was José's patron in the capital, the man who introduced him to Don Alejandro in the first place. The implications hit Lucia like a physical blow. "He might recognize us," she whispered. Diego nodded grimly. If he mentions your connection to José, it could complicate matters significantly. What should we do? Return to San Miguel Seco?" The thought filled her with dread. "No," Diego said firmly. "That's not an option. For now, you and Elena should remain in your quarters as much as possible. I'll speak to Carmelita. She can assign you duties that keep you away from the main house until I've had a chance to explain things to Don Alejandro." Lucia nodded, trying to control the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "And if this Señor Vargas does recognize us?" Diego's jaw tightened. "Let me worry about that. Just promise me you'll be careful, Lucia. Stay close to your mother. Don't venture out alone." The intensity in his voice convinced her more than his words. "I promise," she said, though the pledge felt hollow against the mounting sense of danger. By the time Lucia returned to their quarters, Elena was already there, having been warned by Carmelita that their presence was required elsewhere for the next few days. Her mother's face was calm, but Lucia could see the worry in her eyes. "It will be all right, Mamma," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "Diego will handle it." Elena sighed, sitting heavily on the edge of a chair. "I sometimes wonder if we've simply traded one form of confinement for another." The observation struck Lucia like a slap. "This isn't the same," she protested. "We're free here. We can leave if we choose." "Can we?" Elena asked softly. "Where would we go? With what money? What skills that would feed us in the city?" The questions hung in the air, unanswerable. For all the comparative comfort of their current situation, they remained dependent on Diego's goodwill and Don Alejandro's ultimate approval, neither of which was guaranteed. A heavy silence settled between them as the reality of their circumstances pressed in like the gathering darkness outside. Eventually, Elena rose and began preparing a simple meal from the supplies they kept in their rooms, her movements precise and controlled as always. Lucia watched her mother, seeing for the first time the resilience that had carried Elena through years of hardship with José. "Whatever happens, we face it together," she had said as they left San Miguel Seco. The promise still held. As night fell, the sounds of arrival drifted up from the courtyard below. Horses' hooves on wet cobblestones, men's voices calling orders, the bustle of servants receiving important guests. Lucia resisted the temptation to peek through the curtains, remembering Diego's warning to remain out of sight. Sleep came fitfully that night, disturbed by dreams in which José appeared at their door, his smile triumphant, as he announced he had come to reclaim what belonged to him. The next morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having washed the world clean. Lucia awoke to a gentle knock at their door. Opening it cautiously, she found Pablo standing there, mud-splattered but grinning. "Señor Diego sent me," he announced importantly. "The greenhouse needs checking after the storm. He said you should come help since you know which plants are most delicate." Relief flooded through Lucia. The greenhouse was far from the main house, a sanctuary where she could work without fear of encountering Don Alejandro or his guests. "Thank Pablo," she said, opening the door wider. "Let me get my work clothes." The damage to the greenhouse was minimal, a few broken panes of glass, some fallen plants that needed righting. Lucia threw herself into the work, grateful for the physical activity that kept darker thoughts at bay. By mid-morning, she and Pablo had restored order to most of the structure. As Lucia carefully examined a rare orchid for signs of damage, a shadow fell across the workbench. Looking up, she expected to see Sebastian checking on their progress. Instead, she found herself face to face with a stranger, a tall, elegantly dressed man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of monetary worth. "You must be the new gardener Diego mentioned," the man said, his voice cultured but cold. "He speaks quite highly of your skill with plants." Instinctively, Lucia dropped her gaze, adopting the deferential posture she had perfected in José's household. "Yes, señor, I enjoy the work. Look at me, child." The command, though softly spoken, carried such authority that Lucia found herself obeying without thought. The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her face. "Have we met before?" "There's something familiar about you." Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs. "No, señor," she managed. "I don't believe so." "Where are you from?" "San Miguel Seco," she answered truthfully, her mouth dry with fear. The man, who could only be Don Alejandro himself, continued to stare at her with unsettling intensity. "Such a harsh place to grow such a delicate flower," he murmured, almost to himself. "Tell me, how did Diego discover you?" Before Lucia could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, another figure appeared behind Don Alejandro, a heavy-set man with a florid complexion and small, watchful eyes.
"Alejandro, you must see the damage to the North Fields," the newcomer said impatiently. "Your foreman estimates it will set the harvest back by at least 2 weeks." Don Alejandro's attention remained fixed on Lucia for a moment longer. "We'll speak again," he said finally, the words carrying a weight that felt more like a threat than a promise.
As the two men departed, Lucia realized she had been holding her breath. Releasing it in a shaky exhale, she sagged against the workbench, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. "That was close," Pablo whispered, from where he had been pretending to work nearby. "The fat one is Señor Vargas. He shouted at me this morning for tracking mud into the main house." Lucia nodded, unable to speak, past the knot of fear in her throat. Don Alejandro had recognized something in her, perhaps a resemblance to her father, whom he might have met through business dealings. If he connected her to Jose, everything could unravel. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety. Lucia kept expecting Don Alejandro to return, to demand answers she wasn't prepared to give. When evening came and no summons had materialized, she made her way back to their quarters by a circuitous route that avoided the main house. Elena was waiting, her face drawn with worry. "Carmelita told me Don Alejandro spoke with you," she said without preamble. "What happened?" Lucia recounted the brief interaction, trying to recall every nuance, every expression that might give a clue to Don Alejandro's thoughts. When she finished, Elena's expression had grown, if possible, even more concerned. "We need to speak with Diego," her mother said firmly. "Tonight." As if conjured by her words, a soft knock sounded at their door. Diego entered looking exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than Lucia remembered. "Don Alejandro wants to see you both," he said without preliminary. "Tomorrow morning in his study. Has he spoken with Señor Vargas? Did he recognize us?" Lucia asked, the questions tumbling out before she could stop them. Diego ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had never seen from him before. "Vargas mentioned Jose this afternoon, but only in passing. Don Alejandro made no connection, at least not openly. But he's curious about you, Lucia, very curious. What should we tell him?" Elena asked, her voice remarkably steady given the circumstances. "The truth," Diego replied simply. "All of it. Don Alejandro appreciates honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." "And if he sends us away?" Lucia couldn't help asking. Diego's gaze met hers, held it. "He won't. I won't let that happen." The conviction in his voice should have been reassuring. Instead, it reminded Lucia of how little she truly knew about this man who had upended their lives, this man who, according to Isabella, was ambitious and calculating rather than kind. "You seem very confident of your influence with Don Alejandro," she observed, unable to keep a note of suspicion from her voice. Something flickered in Diego's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or hurt. "I've earned his trust over many years, Lucia, and I've never asked him for anything personal before. Until now," Elena noted quietly. "Until us." Diego nodded, acknowledging the point. "Until you," he agreed, his eyes not leaving Lucia's face. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken words and unnamed emotions. Finally, Diego broke the connection, turning toward the door. "Rest tonight," he advised. Be ready at 9 tomorrow morning.
I'll come for you. After he had gone, Elena sighed heavily. You don't trust him, she stated, rather than asked. Lucia moved to the window, staring out at the star-studded sky. I want to, she admitted, but there's so much he doesn't say, so much we don't know.
Elena joined her, resting a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. What does your heart tell you, Mihija? Lucia closed her eyes, searching for the answer within herself. That he means well, she said finally, that he wants to help us, but also that he has secrets, purposes beyond what he's shared. Elena nodded, accepting this assessment without judgment. Tomorrow, we will learn more, one way or another. As Lucia prepared for bed, her thoughts returned to Diego's parting words. I won't let that happen. The promise echoed in her mind, both comforting and concerning. What would he do to keep that promise? What could he do if Don Alejandro decided they were unwelcome? Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of her father's garden, the one place in her childhood where she had felt truly secure. In the dream, she moved among plants that thrived despite the barren soil, their roots somehow finding water where none should exist. From somewhere beyond the garden, her father's voice reached her, faint but clear. Even in the driest places, life finds a way. Just like these flowers, you must always find a way. Lucia awoke with the first light of dawn, the dream still vivid in her mind. Whatever the day might bring, she would face it as her father had taught her, with courage and the determination to find life where others saw only desolation. The walk to Don Alejandro's study felt interminable. Diego led the way, his back straight, his steps measured as if approaching a duel rather than a meeting. Lucia and Elena followed in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. The main house revealed itself as a place of understated opulence, polished wood floors, quality furnishings imported from Europe, art that spoke of refined taste rather than ostentatious wealth. It was a home designed to impress without appearing to try. Diego paused outside a heavy wooden door, turning to face them. Let me speak first, he said quietly. No matter what happens, remember that you have done nothing wrong. With that cryptic advice, he knocked firmly on the door.
A deep voice bade them enter.
Don Alejandro stood behind a massive desk inlaid with leather, sunlight streaming through the windows behind him, creating a halo effect that Lucia suspected was no accident. The staging was deliberate, the powerful man backlit, his visitors forced to squint slightly to see his expression. Seated in a corner, partially in shadow, was the man Diego had identified as Manuel Vargas. His presence was unexpected and unwelcome, a complication that Diego's tense posture suggested he hadn't anticipated. Ah, Diego, Don Alejandro said, his tone pleasant but reserved. And these must be your protégés. Don Alejandro, Diego replied with a respectful nod. May I present Elena Mendoza and her daughter, Lucia? They have been working at the hacienda for the past 2 weeks while you were in Mexico City. Don Alejandro gestured for them to sit in the chairs arranged before his desk. As they did so, Lucia noticed Vargas leaning forward slightly, his small eyes narrowing as he studied them. Diego tells me you came from San Miguel Seco, Don Alejandro began, addressing Elena directly. A difficult place to make a living, I understand. Yes, senor, Elena replied, her voice remarkably steady. After my husband died, we struggled to maintain our home and land, and yet Diego found you there, a remarkable coincidence. Before Elena could respond, Vargas shifted in his seat, clearing his throat. Mendoza, you say? He directed the question at Elena. Any relation to Emilio Mendoza? Lucia felt her mother tense beside her. My late husband, Elena confirmed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Vargas nodded, a smile spreading across his fleshy face that reminded Lucia uncomfortably of Jose. I thought so. There's a resemblance in the girl. And didn't Emilio's widow remarry to a business associate of mine, Jose Fuentes? The room seemed to still, the air suddenly difficult to breathe. Lucia looked to Diego, who had gone very quiet, his expression carefully neutral. Yes, Elena admitted after a moment's hesitation. I did remarry to Jose Fuentes. The marriage
Was, a mistake. Don Alejandro's eyebrows rose slightly. A mistake that led you to flee with your daughter in the middle of the night. With my employee? Diego stepped forward. Don Alejandro, if I may explain, I expect you to. Alejandro cut him off, his voice sharpening.
But first, I wish to hear from Senora Mendoza herself. Elena straightened in her chair, meeting Don Alejandro's gaze directly for the first time. My second husband is a violent man, Senor. He treated my daughter and me as property rather than family. When Diego came to collect a debt Jose owed to you, he witnessed this situation and offered us an alternative.
Is this true, Diego? Don Alejandro asked, his expression unreadable. Diego nodded once, decisive. Every word. Jose Fuentes is unfit to have authority over anyone, least of all these women. I made a judgment call to bring them here, where they
could be safe and contribute to the hacienda through honest work. Vargas chuckled, the sound oily and unpleasant. This is quite the story you've constructed, my friend. But you see, Jose contacted me last week, distraught over the disappearance of his wife and stepdaughter. He feared they had been kidnapped, or worse. Kidnapped? Lucia couldn't contain her disbelief. He sold me to settle a gambling debt. The blunt statement hung in the air, shocking in its rawness. Vargas's eyes widened slightly while Don Alejandro's narrowed, focusing on Lucia with
new intensity. Explain, he commanded softly. Lucia glanced at her mother, receiving a slight nod of encouragement.
Holding Don Alejandro's gaze, she recounted the scene she had witnessed, Jose offering her to Diego as payment, the casual disregard for her humanity, the years of mistreatment that had preceded that moment. When she finished, the room was silent save for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Don Alejandro's expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had, a coldness that hadn't been there before.
Is this how you conduct business in my name, Manuel? He asked finally, his voice dangerously soft. Associating with men who barter young women like cattle? Vargas shifted uncomfortably. Jose can be traditional in his views, but I assure you,
Alejandro, I had no knowledge of these specific circumstances. Don Alejandro's attention returned to Diego. And you? What were your intentions in bringing Elena and Lucia here without consulting me first? Diego met his employer's gaze steadily. To right a wrong. To honor the memory of my sister. To use the authority you've granted me over the years for something beyond profit. A heavy silence followed this declaration. Lucia found herself holding her breath, sensing that more hung in the balance than merely their future at the hacienda. Finally, Don Alejandro sighed, leaning back in his chair. You've worked for me for 7 years, Diego. In that time, you've proven yourself loyal, intelligent, and above all, principled. If you believe these women deserve our protection, I'm inclined to trust your judgment. Relief washed through Lucia so powerfully she felt momentarily light-headed. Beside her, Elena exhaled softly, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. Vargas, however, wasn't finished. "You can't seriously be considering harboring another man's wife, Alejandro," he protested. "The legal implications alone, Dondi." Alejandro raised a hand, silencing him. The marriage was coerced. Any decent judge would grant an annulment under the circumstances. "Besides," he added, his tone hardening, "I don't recall asking for your opinion on the matter." Turning back to Elena and Lucia, his expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You are welcome to stay at Hacienda Reyes for as long as you wish. Your work has already been noted favorably by my staff. In fact," he continued, glancing at Diego, "Sebastian tells me Lucia has quite a gift with plants. Perhaps she would be interested in the assistant's position in the experimental greenhouse. We've been developing drought-resistant strains that might benefit communities like San Miguel Seco." The offer took Lucia entirely by surprise. The experimental greenhouse was Don Alejandro's pet project, a scientific endeavor few were allowed to participate in. Sebastian had mentioned it only in passing, with reverence approaching awe. "I would be honored, senor," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Don Alejandro nodded as if her acceptance was a foregone conclusion. "Good. You'll begin next week. Diego will show you the protocols." With that, he rose, signaling that the audience was concluded. As they made their way to the door, however, he called Diego back. "A moment of your time," he requested, though the words were clearly a command, rather than a question. Lucia hesitated in the doorway, reluctant to leave Diego alone to face whatever repercussions might still come. Don Alejandro noticed her concern. "Don't worry, child," he said, his tone almost gentle. "I merely wish to discuss business matters with my manager. He is not in any trouble, at least not much." The hint of humor was unexpected, hinting at a relationship between the two men that was more complex than simply employer and employee. Diego nodded reassuringly to Lucia. "I'll find you later," he promised. Outside in the hallway, Elena linked her arm through Lucia's, guiding her away from Don Alejandro's study. Neither spoke until they had left the main house entirely, emerging into the brilliant sunshine of late morning. "We're safe," Elena said finally, wonder in her voice. "Truly safe." Lucia nodded, still processing everything that had occurred. "Donna, Alejandro believes us. He's giving us a place here." "And Jose?" Her mother asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. Lucia considered for a moment. If Don Alejandro could dismiss Vargas's concerns so easily, Jose's objections would carry even less weight. "He has no power here, Mama, no influence." The realization settled over them like a warm blanket. For the first time in 5 years, they were truly beyond Jose's reach, protected not just by distance, but by the authority of a man whose power in the region was unquestioned. As they made their way back to their quarters, Isabella appeared on the path before them, her expression suggesting she had been waiting for this encounter.
"Well, well," she said, her melodious voice carrying a note of surprise. "It seems you've survived your audience with my uncle. How very interesting." Elena bristled visibly at the younger woman's tone. "Don Alejandro was most gracious," she replied.
With dignity. "He has offered Lucia a position in the experimental greenhouse." Isabella's perfect eyebrows rose. "Has he indeed?" She studied Lucia with new calculation in her green-gold eyes. "You continue to surprise me, Lucia, from San Miguel Seco. First Diego, now my uncle. One might almost suspect witchcraft." The barb missed its mark. After facing down Don Alejandro and the ghost of Jose's influence, Isabella's jealousy seemed petty and unimportant.
I merely work hard and speak truthfully, Lucia said calmly. Perhaps you should try it sometime. Elena coughed, barely disguising a laugh. Isabella's eyes widened at the unexpected riposte, then narrowed dangerously. Be careful, little flower,
She warned. The hacienda has a way of changing people, not always for the better. Ask Diego if you don't believe me. With that cryptic remark, she swept past them, her expensive perfume lingering in the air like the threat her words implied. What did she mean about Diego? Lucia wondered aloud. Elena shook her head. Jealousy makes people say cruel things, Mitzi. He, her. Don't let her poison this moment for us. Despite her mother's advice, Lucia found Isabella's words following her throughout the day, raising questions she had pushed aside in the chaos of recent events. Who was Diego truly? What had brought him to Don Alejandro's service? What had he meant when he spoke of honoring his sister's memory? That evening, as shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Lucia found herself drawn to the small chapel that stood on the eastern edge of the hacienda grounds. The simple stone building offered peace she badly needed after the emotional tumult of the morning. Inside, candles flickered before a modest altar, casting warm light on whitewashed walls. Lucia was surprised to find she wasn't alone. Diego knelt in the front pew, his head bowed in what appeared to be prayer or deep contemplation. She turned to leave, not wishing to intrude on a private moment, but a floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Diego looked up, his expression clearing when he saw her. "Lucia," he said, rising, "I was hoping to find you." She moved further into the chapel, drawn by the gentle invitation in his voice. He seemed different here, less the efficient manager, more the man who had offered two desperate women a chance at a new life. "What did Don Alejandro say after we left?" she asked, settling beside him on the worn wooden pew. Diego smiled faintly. "He gave me quite the lecture about making decisions without his approval. And then he doubled my responsibilities." "That sounds
like punishment. He shook his head. It's trust. Don Alejandro doesn't waste time with people he doesn't value.
The added responsibilities are his way of saying I made the right choice, even if the method was unorthodox." Lucia studied his profile in the flickering candlelight, seeing him with new clarity. "Thank you," she said simply, "for risking so much for us." Diego turned to face her fully. "Don Alejandro asked me the same question you did earlier, why I brought you here. Would you like to know what I told him?" Her breath caught in her throat. "Yes. I told him that from the moment I saw you standing in that doorway in San Miguel Seco, I recognized something in you that I've been searching for my entire life: courage, dignity, the ability to remain yourself, even when everything around you conspires to break you." Lucia felt heat rise to her cheeks, grateful for the chapel's dim lighting. "Those are fine qualities in a greenhouse assistant," she managed, attempting to lighten the suddenly charged atmosphere. Diego laughed softly. "Yes, they are, but they're even finer qualities in a partner." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs, so loudly she was certain he must hear it.
"Isabella said you were ambitious," she said, the question she had been holding back finally finding voice. "That everything you do serves Don Alejandro's interests and your own." Diego's expression sobered. "Once, perhaps that was true. After my
sister died, I wanted only two things: security and the power to ensure no one could ever hurt me again. Don Alejandro offered both. And now I want something entirely different." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "If you'll allow it, Lucia, I'd like to court you properly. Not as a debt to be paid or an obligation to be fulfilled, but as a woman worthy of respect and affection." The simple declaration, delivered without grand gestures or flowery words, touched something deep within Lucia. A place she had protected fiercely during the years with José, a place where hope had refused to die completely. "I would like that," she said softly, her fingers curling around his. "Very much." The smile that transformed Diego's face was like sunrise after the longest night, gradual, then brilliant, illuminating everything. For a moment, they sat in companionable silence, hands joined, the chapel's peaceful atmosphere enveloping them. "Tell me about your sister," Lucia asked eventually. "The one you couldn't save?" Diego's expression clouded briefly, but he nodded, accepting her right to know this part of him. Her name was Marisol. She was brilliant, far smarter than me, with dreams of studying medicine in Mexico City. Instead, she married young, to a man who seemed kind until the doors closed behind them. The parallels to Elena's situation were unmistakable. Lucia squeezed his hand gently, encouraging him to continue. By the time I learned how bad things had become, it was too late. He had isolated her completely. When I tried to intervene, she defended him, said she deserved his treatment. 2 months later, she was gone. An accident, they called it. A fall down the stairs. "I'm so sorry," Lucia whispered, feeling the weight of his loss as if it were her own. Diego's eyes, when they met hers, held a clarity born of hard-won wisdom. The will to survive, to thrive even. The chapel door opened then, admitting a shaft of fading daylight, and Pablo, who skidded to a halt when he saw them sitting close together. "Sorry," he exclaimed, backing toward the door. "Doña Matilde sent me to find you both for dinner, but I can tell her you're praying." Diego laughed, rising to his feet and pulling Lucia gently up beside him. "No need, Pablo. We were just finishing our conversation." As they walked back toward the main complex, Diego kept Lucia's hand in his, a public declaration that would undoubtedly fuel the household gossip for weeks to come. Strangely, Lucia found she didn't mind. After years of shame and secrecy, in José's household, the simple openness of Diego's affection felt like liberation. When they reached the courtyard where their paths would diverge, Diego to the main house for dinner with Don Alejandro, Lucia to the staff dining room, he paused, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply sincere. "Until tomorrow," he said softly. "Until tomorrow," she echoed, her heart lighter than it had been in years. As she watched him walk away, Lucia was struck by the realization that her father had been right after all. Even in the driest places, life finds a way. And so had she. 3 months later, the experimental greenhouse bloomed with possibility. Under Lucia's careful attention, seedlings that had previously struggled now thrived, their genetic adaptations to drought conditions proving more successful than Don Alejandro's scientists had dared hope. For their daughter's 22nd birthday, Elena had created a new dress, not the practical garments that had defined Lucia's wardrobe throughout her life, but something beautiful, soft cotton in a shade of blue that matched the sky after, rainfall embroidered with tiny flowers along the hem and neckline. Tonight was special, Eleanor had explained as she helped Lucia prepare. The first dinner to which Don Alejandro had invited not only Diego but Lucia as well, a recognition of her contributions to the experimental greenhouse project, and, though unspoken, of the relationship that had blossomed between her and his
manager. As Lucia approached the main house, golden light spilled from its windows into the twilight, welcoming rather than intimidating. Diego waited on the veranda, his usual working clothes replaced by a crisp white shirt and dark trousers.
that transformed him from manager to gentleman. His eyes, when they found her, held a warmth that needed no words to express. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The dinner passed in a pleasant haze of good food, interesting conversation, and the novel experience of being treated as an equal at Don Alejandro's table. Even Isabella, who had initially reacted to Lucia and Diego's courtship with icy disdain, had grudgingly warmed to a state of polite acceptance. After the meal, as they strolled through the gardens, now silvered by moonlight, Diego led Lucia to a secluded bench beneath a flowering jacaranda tree. "Don Alejandro is sending me to Mexico City next week," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The drought-resistant seeds from your greenhouse project have attracted attention from agricultural officials. He wants me to meet with them to discuss implementation in other regions." Lucia nodded, trying to ignore the pang of anticipated separation. "That's wonderful news. How long will you be gone?" 2 weeks, possibly 3. He hesitated, then took her hands in his. "I'd like you to come with me." The invitation stunned her. "To Mexico City? But my work here can wait," he finished. Gently, Sebastian agrees. "The planting cycle is complete, and Pablo has proven himself capable of maintaining the greenhouse in your absence." The possibility unfurled before her like one of her experimental flowers. Mexico City, with its museums and theaters and libraries. Places she had only read about, experiences she had never dared dream might be within her reach. "And my mother?" she asked, practical concerns intruding on the fantasy. Diego smiled. "I already spoke with Elena. She suggested that if you agreed to accompany me, it might be appropriate for us to marry before departing." "To preserve appearances," she said, "though I suspect she has other motives. Marriage." The word that had once represented imprisonment to Lucia now offered a different vision entirely. Partnership, respect, shared purpose. She searched Diego's face in the moonlight, finding there not possession or demand, but patient hope. "Is that what you want?" she asked softly. "To marry me?" Diego reached into his pocket, withdrawing a simple but elegant ring, a band of silver, set with a single pearl. "It had been my mother's," he explained. "I've carried it since the day I met you, waiting for the right moment to ask." He didn't kneel or make grand declarations. Instead, he simply opened his hand, offering the ring, and with it, a choice. "Will you, Lucia Mendoza, do me the honor of becoming my wife?" In that moment, all the pieces of Lucia's fragmented life seemed to shift into alignment. The hardships in San Miguel Seco, the years under José's oppression, the desperate flight with Diego, the new beginning at Hacienda Reyes, all of it had led her here, to this moment of perfect clarity. "Yes," she said, her voice strong and certain.
"I will." As Diego slipped the ring onto her finger, Lucia felt not the weight of a new obligation, but the lightness of a burden finally set down.
For the first time in her life, she was choosing her own path forward, not fleeing, not surviving, but actively embracing the future she desired. The wedding was a simple affair held in the Hacienda's chapel 3 days later. Elena wept, silent. Tears of joy as Don Alejandro himself walked Lucia down the aisle, a gesture of respect that elevated her in the eyes of everyone present. Carmela and Sofia from Don Guillermo's rancho served as her attendants, while Sebastian stood proudly beside Diego. Even Isabella attended, offering Lucia a pearl hairpin as a wedding gift. "For luck," she said, with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Every bride needs something beautiful." As Lucia and Diego spoke their vows beneath the chapel's modest wooden cross, she found herself remembering her father's words once more. "Even in the driest places, life finds a way. Just like these flowers, you must always find a way." She had found her way, not through the mountains that had once represented escape, but through the harder terrain of her own fear and doubt. The journey had transformed her from a frightened girl in San Miguel Seco to a woman who knew her own worth, who could love without surrendering herself in the process. Later, as they celebrated with a feast that brought together everyone from Don Alejandro to the youngest stable boy, Elena embraced her daughter with tears shining in her eyes. "Your father would be so proud," she whispered. "Not because you married, well, but because you remained true to yourself through everything." Lucia hugged her mother tightly. "We both did, Mama. We both found our way." As the celebration continued around them, Diego appeared at her side, offering his hand for a dance. Lucia took it without hesitation, stepping into the circle of his arms with the confidence of a woman who knew she was exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow would bring Mexico City with its noise and grandeur and endless possibilities. The day after might lead them anywhere, perhaps back to the hacienda, perhaps to distant places where Lucia's drought-resistant plants could transform communities like San Miguel Seco, perhaps someday even to children of their own who would grow up knowing only love and respect in their home. The future stretched before them like an unwritten story. But whatever it held, Lucia would face it, standing tall, her roots strong, her spirit unbroken, a flower that had not merely survived the desert, but learned to bloom in its harsh embrace.